sort of takes me back to when I was about 19 years old, 18, 19 years old, when I was a scallywag, and I was a member of the so-called European Youth Parliament, which still exists, but it's kind of like the model United Nations. But if you could imagine, it meets on a national level in every country. High school kids get to participate, and then if you are sort of selected from that to be part of your national delegation, you go on then to participate in the European Youth Parliament. And we actually got to sit in this building that's on the screen right now, and pretend to be European parliamentarians. It was a lot of fun. So I have if you will, a weak spot for the European Parliament, which is interesting as an anecdote to sort of describe the socialization process that the European Union has been sponsoring, to try to produce a sense of cultural affinity, loyalty, belonging with the institutions. Now, the European Parliament historically had its origins first in Luxembourg. The problem was that it was a consultative entity at first. Today, its primary offices are in Strasbourg and in Brussels, and it splits its activity between those two cities. It has two chambers, so to speak. Now, going way back to the start of the class, we mentioned a gentleman by the name of Altiero Spinelli, and I want to mention him again now to you here, because he was part of an official committee that was put together in 1983 to try to establish how the powers of the European Parliament could be extended. Now, this committee had a kind of a funny name. They were called the Crocodile Club. I don't know why. But their job was really to sort of address the fact that it was already very clear that the institutions of the European Union were not functioning in a manner that was open to democratic participation. And so they created a draft treaty on European Parliament reform, and their idea was to try to sort of assert in the voice for the Parliament to assert in its own voice the need for it to have powers beyond the merely consultative powers that it had up to that point. And the story that I'm going to be telling you in the next few slides really is the story of how those powers came to be, and the implications of those powers for democracy in the EU, which I think is very much an open question. I mean, if the Parliament is thought of today by European Union citizens, I could probably find some data to back this up if I looked. But it has this reputation still of very much being a talking shop, although it is now directly elected, as I will try to show you and argue to you. The elections are not taken all that seriously by the population of the EU. There's very low turnout, and one of the sort of upshots of this is the recent appearance in the European Parliament of new parties that are considered to be conservative, not just conservative, but on the far right, that are taking office in the European Parliament with a view to destroying it, with a view to sort of depth charging it from within, so to speak. And these guys are, the fact that these guys are popular is very much a symptom, I think, of this sense that the European Parliament is not as democratic as it should be. So let's just have a brief overview of the powers and the nature of the European Parliament. The European Union itself, of course, was set up as the successor organization to the EEC, which itself was the successor of the European Coal and Steel Community, set up in Strasbourg in 1952. The Parliament at that early stage was, as I mentioned already, a purely advisory body, and it had just 78 members, all of whom were selected from or seconded from the national parliaments. And it was based in the same site, the same premises as the already established Council of Europe, which is a body we've mentioned a couple of times, but I've not really gone into details about it because it's not a body that's actually associated with the European Union. It's a separate entity altogether. Now, when the EEC was established in 1958, yes, I know I just mentioned a third council. Again, I've tried to talk about this in the past. There's a lot of councils. There's the Council of Ministers, which is sometimes just known as the Council, right? We talked about that. There's the European Council, which we're just talking about a couple of slides ago. And then, of course, there's this non-EU body called the Council of Europe. I understand your pain. It does get confusing. But yeah, when the EEC, the European Economic Community, was established in 1958 under the Treaties of Rome, membership of the European Parliament expanded from the original coal and steel community membership, which was 78, to a new number, which was 142. And membership again got expanded in 1973 with the new accessions, Britain, Ireland, etc., to 198. Now, in the last couple of decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then subsequently, we've had major geopolitical change in Europe, which has allowed for several waves of new members to accede to the EU. Membership increased substantially, 518 to 567 in June 1994, with the advent of German reunification. And again, in January 1995, we had Austria, Finland, Sweden joining, and they brought with them some new members. In 2004, the number goes up to 732 with the accession of 10 new countries. A lot of them were former Eastern European. Well, they're not former Eastern European, they're still Eastern European, but I mean former Eastern Bloc countries. And so the numbers have increased as the seats are allocated according to the size of the population. Now, something to keep in mind, the US Congress is capped at 435 seats, and that's been the case since 1929. So the EU Parliament has many more seats than the US Congress. The size of the European Parliament today is 751. Since the accession of Croatia brought in a couple of new seats. So how are these parliamentarians nominated? How are they elected? Election procedure does vary a little bit from state to state, but there's and of course that's the same in the United States. State to state, you have different voting rules determined by the states. But since 1999, all the states have converged finally to embrace some form of what's called proportional representation, which is a bit of a strange beast. If you've never heard of it before, it's going to be kind of a foreign concept to American audience. But it's quite common in Europe. Ireland, the country I come from, actually has it as its national election mechanism, national voting mechanism, and so does Malta. But those are the only countries that have it at the national level. But at the EU level, for European Union elections, remember these guys are directly elected every 5 years, we have proportional representation. So I should take a moment to explain in a very sort of slapdash way, I suppose. But what is proportional representation? Well, in the United States, you only have one seat per constituency, right? And it's a first winner take all proposition. If you get the most votes, you get the seat. Now, one of the disadvantages of that is it tends to corral members of parliament, congressmen, into one or another of two parties. Proportional representation is seen as a solution to that problem. If you want to have more than two parties, you have to get rid of the winner takes all proposition, and you introduce instead what are known as multi-seat constituencies, and these are usually weighted for population. So you order all the candidates that you like in your area that are running for these 3-4 seats or what have you. You order your voter roll, you write out numbers, and you order your candidates in your preference, in your order of preference. And then they count the total amount of ballots cast, and they figure out what a minimal threshold is to get one person over the hump into one of the slots. And then they take any surplus from the first person across the post and look at the second order preferences of the votes for that person and transfer those second preference votes to the next most popular candidates as determined in the votes. So it means that say I really want party A to get voted, but I kind of have a good feeling about a candidate in a lesser known party. Now, he wouldn't be someone I'd vote for as a first preference because he's probably not going to get elected. He's not that well known, but I'd take a risk on him for my second preference. So my first guy gets across, my second preference vote can go to this riskier candidate on the margin, and he has a chance of getting elected because maybe other people are willing to risk him as well. So what that means then is that, and this is the reason that we have PR, is that it permits candidates from less well-known parties to have a fairly decent chance of getting into Parliament. And one such figure is on the screen right now, and his name is Nigel Farage. I mention him because he was the first foreign politician to meet Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, upon taking office in this year after the 2016 election. He's a controversial figure, is Farage, because he is the leader, or at least was the leader until recently, of the British UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which is a fairly conservative to far-right party whose sole purpose is to pursue Brexit, that is the British exit from the European Union, something we'll be talking about later in this semester. So Prior gives some succor to those who believe that the European Parliament has, that the European institutions overall, have a kind of a democratic deficit. And the idea here is that the Parliament is going to represent as diverse a range of interests and parties as possible. I'll give you guys a breakdown on that on the next slide. Here we go. So I don't know if you can zoom in on this or make this YouTube video take up your full screen. But if you do that, what you will see is that we have on the screen a list of countries, and we also have a sense of the population in those countries and the number of MEPs that those countries have for their population weight. And you can see clearly that in the gray column you have population per MEP in 2009 figures, and just have a look and see how similar this is to the way the American Electoral College works. If you're familiar with it, the great criticism that many people would have, Hillary Clinton of course won the popular vote, so did Al Gore when he went up against George Bush, and a lot of people were upset that Hillary Clinton, even though she won by I think 2 or 3 million votes, I can't remember the exact figure right now, she won the popular vote by a significant margin, quite generous margin by most people's standards for winning a US presidential election. She didn't win the Electoral College votes. And that's because if you're in a less populated Midwestern state, for example, or even more even remote state like Dakota, your vote matters more than someone who would vote in one of the coastal cities or states, California, New York, for example. They get less electoral college votes than someone from Dakota. So you see the same principle playing out here. I'm just looking on my other screen so I can see it in a large size as well. We have DE, which means Germany, an overall population of 82 plus million. Number of MEPs, 99, has a significant and a generous number of MEPs, but it takes 830 German votes, German citizens, to get an MEP into office. Looking down the scale, you see at the very bottom, MT, Malta, 410,000 people living on the island of Malta. They have 5 MEPs, and the number of Maltese citizens it takes to get one MEP elected is just 82,060, which is a huge difference. Now, I nicked this graph, this data, from a website from a guy that's proposing reform to the European Parliament. He wants there to be an extra 18 MEPs, and he believes that if that could be done, it would significantly change the distribution and make it more balanced, more favorable to states in the sort of middle to a small category, not quite as small as Malta, but you can certainly see that he's hoping to make a difference in some of the countries like Netherlands, Ireland. Let's see if I can find Ireland on there. Yeah, that would not change much for Ireland, actually, but certainly for Holland, Spain, other countries like that, it would change some things. Anyway, I'm not super familiar with his theory. I just wanted to show you the first part of the data to give you a sense of the weighting of these votes. Now, the European Parliament seats in the 2014 election. I wanted to show you this slide just to give you an insight into some of the facets of the way the European Parliament works. Now, the MEPs, as they're called, members of the European Parliament, do not sit in international delegations. They don't represent national parties. Rather, they sit as part of political umbrella groupings. And these roughly do correspond to the traditional party structure that most European countries have, but not all, which would be roughly left-right in nature. So there are ideological affinities between these umbrella groupings and the parties of the members back home. Traditionally, the largest grouping in the European Parliament is the Socialist Grouping, the PES. The PES are sometimes known as, are currently known as the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. It has, and I'm going to show you some information in the next slide to give you a sense of the historical ebb and flow of the party since 1979. In recent times, conservative parties have been making more progress in the European Parliament. And the main conservative party is known as the European People's Party, the EPP. It's the traditional conservative umbrella group. It comprises roughly the Christian Democratic parties in Europe, you know, the German Christian Democrats, for example, and a couple of other centre-right parties. Once upon a time, the British Conservative Party would have been a member of this grouping as well, but they departed under controversial circumstances to form an umbrella group of their own with a Polish Conservative Party, and now they are known as the European Conservatives and Reformists, and you can see in 2014 they got 46 seats. Now, further to the right, that dark orange or burnt orange color there, you can see that there's 38 seats for the Europe of Freedom and Democracy Party. Now, that's the big shift really that happened in 2014, was the arrival of the EFDD. Now, EFDD, as it's called, is the party or the grouping that includes the British Independence Party that we've referred to previously as UKIP, the UK Independence Party, and that's the party of the aforementioned British politician Nigel Farage, who, as I mentioned, was the first foreign politician that President Trump met upon taking office. And that's significant, as I think, because Farage is kind of trying to represent on the sort of British wing of things, European wing of things, a kind of a sovereigntist movement that is, roughly speaking, anti-globalization, and trying to sort of argue that globalization has gone too far. There's too much intercultural mingling going on because of immigration, that we're losing national values, all the rest. So you can see an affinity between the electoral platform of Trump and someone like Farage. Farage has been a leading voice in the British Brexit movement. I understand he's not currently leading the UKIP party because once the Brexit referendum passed, he felt that his role as a leader in that party was no longer necessary. But I believe he still serves as a member of Parliament in that capacity. And later this semester, we're going to have a lot more to say about Brexit and enlargement, and I'm looking forward to that discussion with you. But I'll leave that on the shelf just for now, just to briefly wrap up the subject at hand here. We should talk about the ALDE, which is kind of a centrist party, a centrist liberal party, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe. We also, interestingly enough, in the EU have two green parties. There's a sort of a nationalist green party, which is called the Greens are European Free Alliance, Greens EFA. That includes the Scottish Nationalist Party, which, if you are familiar with recent British history, there was a referendum a couple of years ago with a very, very high turnout, which was addressing the question whether Scotland should become its own country and leave the United Kingdom. A more sort of traditional socialist green party or left-wing green party, most European green parties are in the various nation states rather, would be somewhat left-wing in their orientation, more socialist in their orientation, and so they are represented in the grouping called the European United Left / Nordic Green Left, NGL, UNL NGL, and you can see them there on the screen at the far left. I don't know that means they're more to the left of the Democrats. I think that's just a way of positioning them. That said, their numbers have been shifting, slowly declining over the years in favor of the more centrist Green Party. We also have a fairly large number of independents. They are a significant force, and as you'll see on the next slide, their numbers have been increasing slightly over recent decades. Now, on this slide, we have a breakdown of European Parliament representation by grouping since 1979. And the broad picture really is a shrinkage of the socialists, a shrinkage of the green left, increasing number of greens, increasing number of independents. The mainstream conservative party, I think, largely holding its own. The Liberal Party increasing slightly. They would be the yellow there. And then the arrival, of course, you can see of that orange bracket, which is the far right and conservative factions sort of taking their position. Now, this is our last slide for this week. We're just going to briefly go through the powers of the European Parliament. Now, we have discussed before the power of sanction that the Parliament has over the Commission. So the Commission is accountable to the Parliament. And we mentioned before, last week in fact, that it was typically regarded as a kind of a theoretical power, a so-called nuclear option. But it has surfaced at least once where in 1999, I think it was. Yes, the Jacques Delors commission chose to resign, then face that power. And the commission, I think it is safe to say, has been more leery of confrontation with the parliament ever since. Similarly, in 2004, the parliament threatened to refuse to endorse the Barroso Commission until an Italian commissioner, who was a controversial figure, we discussed him last week, stood aside. So clearly the parliament has is a force to be reckoned with in respect of accountability of the commission. But the parliament has some other functions as well, including a reporting function in the office of the Ombudsperson of the European Parliament, which was a position that was created under the Maastricht Treaty. The current Ombudsperson in the Parliament is a woman by the name of Emily O'Reilly, who is a former Irish journalist and who was the Ombudsperson of the Republic of Ireland, actually, for a number of years. She has gone on to serve that capacity now for the European Parliament. And it's an interesting role for those of you maybe browsing around for topics for your term papers. The evolution of the office of the Ombudsperson and the powers of the office of the Ombudsperson would be an interesting topic to look at in relationship to, for example, the question of the democratic deficit. Now, the legislative powers of the European Parliament have certainly strengthened since 1987, excuse me, where once the Council had, the full sort of authority in all cases. Today, that authority of the Council has been shared, and now there is co-decision between the Council and the Parliament. And interestingly, since Maastricht, this principle of co-decision has started to be referred to now as the ordinary legislative procedure, which is kind of Euro-speak, or technocratic babble, perhaps. But I think the point is to sort of suggest that it is now the norm that the European Parliament's powers have evolved from the merely consultative powers of the Parliament Assembly in the coal and steel community through to the SEA, which gave the Parliament a cooperative function, to now sort of refer under Maastricht and Lisbon as to these powers as the ordinary legislative procedure. Suggests that in all areas of EU policy, from agriculture to transport, environmental policy, etc., that the European Parliament is here to stay, that it has, as equal a right to speak and vote and have a say in the legislative process as the Council. But it does raise the question: what happens if the Council of Ministers and the Parliament cannot find consensus? Well, a sort of short answer to that is that there is a conciliation committee convened between the two bodies, and more often than not, historically, they do find agreement, but should it come to pass that they can't find a text that is satisfactory to everyone, then the act is not adopted. And I think that does sort of indicate that the Parliament really does have a power to refuse legislation. And it's very important, I think, to recognize that whatever the EU is now in a supranational sense, the Parliament certainly has increased its powers. It's perhaps arguable then that European Union citizens should be taking the EU more seriously, and the elections specifically to the Parliament more seriously. More people should be participating in them, because the European Parliament, does have considerable power, and if people aren't voting for parliamentarians, then they're not going to have their interests represented. An important power that the European Parliament also gained since the Maastricht Treaty is that the Parliament can, by majority vote, require the Commission to legislate in a certain area. To me, that's profoundly important as a power. The Parliament can order the Commission to generate certain type of legislation. Usually, that power of initiation is something that we see only in the executive of the Intergovernmental Council, the European Council, or the Commission itself. So to see now the Parliament acting as a traditional Parliament might, developing this power to sort of tell the bureaucracy to create, to draft legislation. You can kind of imagine that these are sort of early precedents in the creation of a sort of a fully fledged European democracy. And maybe that's just the idealist in me speaking, but I don't think it's insignificant. So just a couple more points and then we'll wrap it up for today. The European Parliament has gained powers in terms of overseas relations, external relations. The Parliament has the right to approve or reject international treaties. This is very, very important. It means that the Parliament can threaten and have influence by virtue of the fact that it has this power to voice an opinion on, for example, free trade negotiations and that kind of thing. But it has only this power to approve or reject. It has no formal role to consult in relationship to them. And it remains the case that this power does not apply in the realm of what we might call high politics. So anything pertaining to the single currency, to defense policy, to taxation, the European Parliament does not have any sort of vote whatsoever in those areas. It's only a consultative role. So Parliament becoming quite fully fledged in areas pertaining to the acquis, but not really having all that much power really in the sort of grand political sense of military affairs or taxation. And so in that sense, then the Parliament's power of the purse is not fully formed. That said, speaking of the power of the purse, let's just quickly look now for our last topic at the budgetary powers of the Parliament, which are quite significant outside of the area of taxation policy. And why would taxation policy, just as a footnote, be a problem? Well, because that would imply a supranationalization of the power to tax, right? And if you know your US history, for example, if we're still in the business of making comparisons with US history, that was kind of the decisive moment in the formation of the US federal government as well. You know, the relinquishing of the nation states of the power to federal government to create a national budget was something that was long contested, and there had to be Supreme Court cases about that before that could be established. So the annual EU budget must be presented before the Parliament, and they have to agree it. This is not a power to raise taxation, of course, but it is a power to have a say in how the budget is allocated, which I think is not insignificant. Now, the drafting of the budget is the responsibility of the Commission, of course, and that makes sense given everything we've said about the Commission to this point. The Commission has the responsibility then to bring this budget to the Council of Ministers, which can revise it and submit it then to the Parliament, and the Parliament has a 45-day window to make amendments or modifications of the budget. Now, prior to the Lisbon Treaty, certain sections of the budgets were restricted from parliamentary scrutiny, and that has since been changed now that the Parliament has full scrutiny over the entire budget, which is a major step forward. The Parliament can pass the budget or not pass the budget. If it passes the budget, it has to pass it by a 2/3 majority. So that does mean that, rather than a simple majority, the entire a generous portion of the Parliament has to be involved in it. So that's it for our two institutions this week, folks. We've looked at the European Council, which is a kind of a shared executive function with the Commission, and that brings a kind of a classic intergovernmental element to to generating the momentum. As we said, it's the motor of the European Union. It's generating the momentum for the major leaps forward. And then on the other end of the spectrum, talking about the European Parliament, the voice of the European people, perhaps not taken as seriously as it should be, historically has low participation in the elections, but interesting in a number of ways, because it has a sort of an uncharacteristic mechanism for the election, which is designed in order to bring in minority voices and a diversity of voices into the chamber, and for better or for worse, bringing in people across the spectrum, from the far left to the centre to the far right, even now including people like Nigel Farage's party UKIP, which have only one focus in their entire existence, and that is to get rid of the European Parliament. We've also discussed the transformation of powers, the budgetary powers, for example, the power to sanction the European Commission, the power to call for legislation from the Commission now. All of this, and of course the co-decision with the Council of Ministers, really do suggest that, in my lifetime, this institution, since 1979 onwards, has really been growing in its role. It's a fascinating institution. It's one I'm particularly interested in myself, and perhaps one that you might be interested in if you're thinking about an essay topic for this semester. So thank you for paying attention to this week, guys. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Best wishes.